The last frontier begins with the U.S. Marshals escorting a heavily shackled inmate onto a transport plane loaded with other prisoners. Everything seems routine until an explosion blows out part of the aircraft mid-flight. In the chaos, that same heavily guarded inmate somehow slips free. The pilots barely manage to crash land the wounded plane in the frozen edges of Alaska, but the real problem has only just begun. Frank Remnick, a U.S. Marshal who has literally given his entire life to this badge, is supposed to be winding down and planning a quiet future in a little cabin for his wife Sarah and their son Luke. Instead, he's dragged into what becomes the most dangerous day of his career. When he and his team arrive at the crash site, they don't even get a chance to breathe. The escaped prisoners ambush them immediately, trying to hijack their helicopter. Frank's closest friend is stabbed, and though they rush him to the hospital, he doesn't make it. The only bright spot is that they managed to rescue one surviving marshal from the original transport team. The CIA immediately learns of the plane crash, and it becomes obvious that the shackled inmate has something to do with them. They dispatch Agent Sydney Schofield, who was initially sidelined to Alaska with one goal: retrieve their asset. She's instructed to gain the trust of local law enforcement, especially Frank, because without local help, she's lost in the Alaskan wilderness. Frank talks to the injured marshal they rescued, identified as Granger. Granger tells Frank they made an unscheduled pit stop to pick up a hooded, heavily guarded prisoner named Havelock. The man was too smart, too self-assured, and Granger suspects Havelock is behind the crash. Frank pushes for details, but Granger clams up and is taken to the hospital under Sarah's care. With the escaped convict so close, a safety advisory is issued. The local school game is canceled, and everyone is told to stay put. Unfortunately, Frank's son Luke and his girlfriend never get the announcement because they're off sneaking out to spend some romantic alone time at Frank's new cabin. Great timing, kids. Sydney arrives, and Frank immediately bombards her with questions. She tries the classified routine until Frank mentions Havelock. Sydney realizes she has to spill the truth. Havelock, real name Levi Taylor Hartman, is a former CIA asset, trained under the Atwater Protocol, a lethal program meant to smoke out enemies of the US by leaking fake intel. When the targets show up, they die. Sydney herself trained Havelock in weapons, language, and straight-up killing. He disappeared a month ago and was captured 2 days prior along the Sino-Russian border. The prison plane was a cover to bring him home. Whatever Havelock is planning, the crash was just step one. Frank is convinced Havelock had inside help bringing the explosives on board. But who? Soon, they get a radio call from a lone man on an outpost being held captive by Havelock. Sydney confirms it must be their man, as the resources at the outpost would give him the perfect chance to disappear. Frank and the team converge on the house, but when Frank refuses to shoot the criminal, Sydney throws dogs at the man, who ends up dying. But it's not Havelock. Just then, the passenger manifest arrives. One of the dead men, dressed in a criminal uniform, is actually U.S. Marshal Granger. The horrible realization hits Frank. The man he talked to, the injured marshal, was Havelock all along. Frank frantically calls Sarah, but it's too late. When he gets to the hospital, Havelock is gone, and so is his wife. Havelock immediately sabotages the radio tower, completely killing cell service and internet. Frank is enraged at Sydney for failing to show him what Havelock looked like. His troubles only get worse when Luke's school calls to say he isn't at school, and Havelock radios in that Frank has to do what he wants now, if he wants his wife to continue to stay alive. The CIA finally pieces together Havelock's masterstroke. He accessed the agency's internal network through an old backup server, and got his hands on a file ominously called Archive 6, which is basically the CIA's super-secret, highly classified kill list. It's the full record of every single person the agency has ever terminated under the Atwater Protocol. If this gets out, it causes major international incidents. And because Havelock is nothing if not an excellent extortionist, he immediately informs the CIA that the explosive data is on a countdown. Unless he manually hits the snooze button every 72 hours, this very naughty information goes to every interested party across the globe. With the phone tower down, Frank goes on to inform the town to stay vigilant and sends an officer in search of his son. But he learns from his neighbor that Sarah was spotted at home. He immediately rushes home, knows Sarah, but he finds a video camera set up. It becomes obvious Havelock has been inside Frank's network the whole time. He's hacked the U.S. Marshals database, copied the flight manifest, and even stolen some of Frank's personal gear and clothes. The ransom tape Havelock left is focused on one person, the inmate who was in seat 12A of the crashed plane. Havelock's demand is straightforward: swap the man for Sarah. Sydney urges Frank to make the trade, but Frank is a brick wall. He absolutely refuses until he knows who this mysterious inmate is and why Havelock is so fixated on him. The mystery man is identified as Henry Sickler, a high-level money launderer who decided to surrender to the DOJ for witness protection earlier that day. He was running from his own criminal bosses because they caught him stealing. When questioned, Sickler swears he has never heard the name Havelock. So the question remains, why is this seemingly small-time informant the key to Havelock's gigantic, terrifying plan? Well, it turns out Havelock needs Sickler to broker a deal for him, with a buyer for the infamous Archive-6. In the meantime, Sarah, proving she's not one to just sit around, tries her best to escape and even lunges at Havelock, but the man shoves her down the stairs, tragically knocking her unconscious. As much as Frank loves his wife, handing over a key person to a criminal is just hard for him to do without knowing the full picture. The push he needs comes from Sydney, who wisely lays out the devastating reality of Havelock's stolen Archive-6 and how badly that information would hurt the entire country. They decide to go to the exchange, but they aren't sending the real Sickler. Instead, Frank's partner, Hutch, is disguised as Henry. They learn soon enough that Havelock doesn't actually want the guy at all. It's just a clever ploy to get all law enforcement agents in one place so he can waltz over and steal the plane recordings. By the time Frank realizes the deception and rushes to the transport vehicle, Havelock has already accessed the evidence and taken exactly what he needs. The only thing he leaves behind is a small, unmarked box just for Frank. The marshal opens it, his face heavy with dread, but the contents, like so much else in this messy affair, remain a total mystery for now. And finally, we check in on Luke and his girlfriend, the Lovebirds, who picked the absolute worst possible time to go on a romantic getaway. They're stuck in a cabin with zero reception and a whole lot of heavy snow. They then stumble upon an unconscious inmate in the back of their truck. Because they couldn't hear any information about the town's very serious predicament, they decide to be decent human beings and take him in to nurse him back to health. The officer Frank sent after his son finally reaches the cabin, but the kids are nowhere to be found. Instead, he walks straight into the escaped inmate they nursed back to health and gets knocked out cold. The noise wakes Luke and Kira, and when they return, they find only the inmate waiting for them. Luke lets slip that his dad is a U.S. Marshal, and even though Luke doesn't suspect a thing, Kira is side-eyeing the man. Her intuition pays off when she spots the officer's car outside and finds documents, revealing the man they rescued is an escaped convict. She alerts Luke. They try to make a run for it, but it's too late. They're caught and held hostage. The content of the box Havelock left Frank is Sarah's car keys. Though Havelock is long gone, they spot her car, and Frank uses the navigation system to finally track down his missing wife. Now for the big question, why on earth did Havelock just let his major bargaining chip go? Earlier that day, 3 inmates, Volpe, Porter, and Covington, captured a father and son. The dad told his son Caleb to run when he had the chance, which he did, and now he meets up with Frank to pinpoint his dad's location. Havelock runs right into these 3 inmates while on the run from the marshals he just embarrassed. He plays the role of a stranded camper just to hitch a ride, and they all stumble upon the most incredible getaway car ever, a massive Alyeska Arctic Adventures Tundra buggy. It is basically an armored school bus for Arctic sightseers. They hold the entire tour group hostage, hijack the buggy, and start their journey. But the inmates begin to suspect Havelock is not who he claims to be. The Fed's continuous radio chatter about a very special inmate gets Spencer questioning if Havelock was the shackled guy on the plane. And once Havelock realizes his cover is toast, he promptly kicks everyone's butt and takes over the entire vehicle. Sydney is trying to get more information about Havelock from Sarah when Havelock radios Frank. He announces that since he held up his end of the bargain and freed Sarah, Frank now owes him something: Sydney's Xenogate passcode. This code is basically the ultimate address book, holding the location and identity of every agent Sydney has in the field. To ensure Sydney hands over this disastrously important code, Havelock shoots one of the inmates, pretends it is one of the new hostages, and threatens to keep going. Sydney, facing an impossible choice, reluctantly gives up the code. Frank, who has been fuming at Sydney ever since his wife was taken, finally softens up. Sydney reveals her father created the archive after 9/11, and now she is facing the terrible consequences. Frank, in turn, opens up about his guilt over the daughter he lost right before her 9th birthday. It is a genuine, teary moment as they head off to the location Caleb pinpointed. They arrive at the location, and Frank tries to bargain for Caleb's dad, but Havelock just skips the small talk and says he knows about Frank's secret basement. Frank's reaction suggests he has something seriously hidden down there. While the 2 men are having their tense chat, Sydney is already working on a backup plan. She attaches a chain to the buggy, ripping the entire hostage compartment into the air. The inmates tumble out and get scooped up by the authorities. But this is Havelock, remember? He drives the vehicle, which is still dangling from the helicopter, straight toward a cliff. Frank throws himself onto the vehicle, and the 2 men fight as they skid toward the edge. They end up dangling over the drop, Sydney swoops in, gun drawn, but she hesitates. That is all the chance Havelock needs. He kicks out the windshield and jumps down the cliff. Why did Sydney hesitate, you ask? Well, they used to date, and Havelock played her like a fiddle. We've got two new fugitives joining our jailbreak party. Kitty, a convicted black widow with $4.2 million tucked away, and Vivian, a con artist who's basically been scamming since kindergarten. Our duo is having a rough start. Kitty's leg is caught in a gruesome animal trap, and she needs medical attention, so Vivian holds a resident named Ruth Reed at gunpoint for a first aid kit. But once Kitty frees herself, the first thing she does is smash Ruth's head in. They ransack Ruth's house for supplies and a change of clothes until they spot her trooper car outside. The initial head smashing didn't quite kill Ruth, so Kitty decides to finish her up now. One thing we know for sure is that cops do not play about murdered officers. At first, they think Ruth's death is Havelock's doing, until Frank checks a trail camera and sees the killers are the two female inmates. But hold that thought, because Havelock is involved. Vivian changed out of a sweatshirt Frank recognizes because Havelock stole it from his house, which means Kitty and Vivian are now a top priority catch since they have been rubbing elbows with the big bad guy. Their next stop is a diner, where a trooper shows up, but he doesn't seem to recognize them. Vivian puts on a spectacular show about being an abused girl escaping her terrible mother. She uses this elaborate act to steal a car key and flees with Kitty. The authorities quickly figure out the women are headed to a local flight scene tour company called Aero Excursions, after finding a phone book with a key page ripped out, which they left while hurrying to escape. They need a flight to Canada, stat, and they also need a pilot. They grab Slade, a bush pilot, and order him to fly them north. Fuel is expensive, but Kitty has a plan. Her hidden money chip, cleverly concealed in her glasses. Frank and Sydney soon learn the fugitive's location, and thankfully for the police, the women are no longer in sync. Kitty, sick and desperate from her injury, ditches Vivian and makes a break for the runway with Slade. Vivian in turn sells out her partner to the police in exchange for immunity. When Kitty gets caught, she pleads with the cops to end her suffering, but they wouldn't, so she lunges at Frank and Sydney fulfills her wishes. Before the exchange earlier, Havelock sent a meetup message to someone, and that message has now been decoded by the FBI, helping with the hunt for the fugitives. It was sent to an informant in St. Petersburg named Armen Zhdanko, a specialist in malware and security protocols. Sydney receives a photo showing Zhdanko handing a briefcase to a courier just 3 days earlier. The team believes Havelock is trying to create a hardware version of Archive 6, which he can then sell. Zhdanko has done that, and has handed it to a courier, bringing it straight to Havelock. Frank pulls flight records for Russian travelers heading into Fairbanks, and spots a man using a legit passport, but carrying a stack of fake IDs under the name Vincent Tiago. The chase is officially on to catch the courier before Havelock gets his hands on the archive. We learn more about Havelock and Sydney's past relationship. They were actually married. It started as a ruse for an undercover operation, but then turned real, at least for Sydney. Havelock might have just been playing the long con to get access to her network, which sparks a big realization in Frank. Vivian played them all. It's been all about Kitty's money. Vivian didn't know where Kitty's money was until the chip came out of the glasses, and that's when she nabbed it. She called the police on herself, securing her immunity, and now she has the money and the freedom. Talk about a clean getaway. Frank catches her, and she finally spills the real beans about Havelock. She saw him 2 days ago, and that's when he gave her the sweatshirt, completely contradicting her earlier story about getting it on the plane. Sarah is urged to start therapy, but all that's on her mind is finding her son. She decides to head to the cabin herself with her therapist as her driver since her car is still in lockup, but when she gets there, all she finds is the officer's body. Luke and Kira are being driven by the fugitive to God knows where, but they are not just going to sit in the car helplessly. Luke uses a coded story about his friend's dad who died without wearing a seatbelt to signal Kira to buckle up. He then pops the driver's belt loose on purpose, causing an accident. The seatbelt saves them both, and Luke urges Kira to run. Luckily, Kira doesn't freeze to death in the wilderness. A native man named Cal finds her while he's out hunting. She is barely conscious from the cold, but Cal carries her back to his tribe, where they warm her up with animal furs. Havelock seems to need something again, because he calls Frank, asking if he can be trusted, and dangling his basement secret over him. Frank, however, is just buying time for his people to trace the call, which they successfully do, pinpointing room 130 of the Klondike Lodge on the park's highway. Just as the team is about to storm the place, Frank gets the good news about Kira. He heads off to play rescue dad, leaving Sydney and the others to handle the lodge raid. They burst in, but surprise, no Tiago. Instead, they find Archive 6 just sitting right there. It is immediately obvious Havelock wanted them to find it. Why give up your golden ticket? Sydney smells a rat, a Trojan horse, if you will, and wants to wait for Frank before handing it to the FBI. But Hutch, being a rigid stickler for protocol, ignores her. The fake passports and lack of fingerprints on Tiago's belongings only solidify Sydney's suspicion that this whole thing is a setup. Sydney realizes her home is bugged, and she calls her family to warn them off the main line. When she hangs up, guess who is standing there? Havelock. It is an awkward reunion for the former spouses. He tries to proposition her to run off to another country, but there is absolutely no way in hell Sydney takes that offer. Frank arrives at the tribe and shows Kira photos. She identifies their captor as Romero, a terrifyingly dangerous man who is clinically paranoid and criminally insane. Just wonderful. Romero catches up with Luke, who, despite having a gun, is too moral to shoot a bad guy. He then steals a state-owned salt truck and speeds away, muttering about having work to do. We learn Romero isn't just any fugitive. He's a former DARPA prodigy. DARPA is the US agency that builds the kind of cutting-edge tech the rest of the world won't see for decades. And Romero's specialty was advanced mechanical surveillance. But somewhere along the way, his brilliant mind snapped. He became convinced the government was watching him, and that paranoia spiraled so violently that he ended up killing several coworkers, and even his neighbor's dog. Romero and Luke head to a substation, steal a massive metal contraption, and plunge the area into darkness. Their destination is the top-secret HAARP lab. Frank and Sarah arrive too late, finding only a glove from Luke, confirming he is still in danger. Frank immediately reports the missing equipment, but the HAARP lab is completely unconcerned, smugly confident in their impenetrable reserve battery, unaware that Romero's sabotage has turned their reserve system into a ticking time bomb. In the midst of all this, Sarah finally comes clean. Havelock gave her a chip to give to Frank after she was released, but she held onto it out of pure, gut-wrenching fear stemming from a past trauma in Chicago. That chip holds the plane crash recording. Havelock might be trying to tell Frank he wasn't behind the crash at all. Frank is understandably furious. His wife kept this vital information from him all this time. Their marital meltdown is interrupted when Frank notices a trail of salt leading off the main road. Luke, that brilliant kid, has been leaving a trail from the stolen salt truck. However, Romero and Luke have already reached the HAARP facility, and the genius paranoia is at full tilt. Luke tries to be the hero, smashing the stolen machine, but Romero pulls a gun. He quickly switches tactics, playing into his madness, just to buy time to stab him and flee. Frank and Sarah arrive as Romero begins to chase after Luke, and the chase ends when Sarah, in full mama bear mode, drives directly into Romero, leaving him a broken, twisted mess. That night, the community gathers at the bar to honor the memory of Frank's Marshall friend Donnie that died at the crash site. But Sydney's peaceful night is interrupted by a frantic call from her sister Molly. The FBI is at Sydney's house and seizing everything. Since Sydney has so much history with Havelock, they believe she is complicit. Frank is connecting the dots and realizing the whole picture is messy. Why would Havelock swipe the flight deck recording from the Marshalls during Caleb's dad's exchange, only to send it on this long, ridiculous detour through his wife back to Frank? It makes zero sense. Then he learns the Archive 6 left at the motel is a fake, just navigational prompts for a plane, not state secrets. That's when things start clicking. Maybe Havelock didn't bring down the plane at all. And Tiago showing up in Alaska a full 24 hours before the crash, like he already knew exactly where that plane would hit the ground, only makes that suspicion stronger. The Marshalls didn't even know the plane had been rerouted. The only people who did were the CIA, which means the CIA sent Tiago, and he may have been delivering the malware that brought down the plane, intending to kill Havelock. And now Havelock is pointing the Marshalls straight to it. They have no idea if Sydney is involved, so he and Hutch are keeping it hush-hush for now. They are interrupted by Sarah, who wants Frank to choose between his family and his job. They were literally about to have a nice, peaceful life before all this happened, and her kid was put in danger. Luckily for Frank, he is saved by Cole, who has been studying Romero's videos and has deduced Romero's plan. The HAARP's failsafe has a switch that sends a signal whenever they enter backup mode. Without that switch, which Romero removed, the system will overload. The combined energy from the main and backup grids will knock out power across the whole region. But before he even finishes explaining, the entire town goes dark. Even after a complete town-wide blackout, thanks Romero, the problems just keep escalating. The hospital is predictably overcrowded, and Sarah, who is helping out, spots a man posing as an EMT who looks suspiciously like one of the escaped convicts. This man is Dr. William Wigg, a brilliant and dangerous serial killer known as the Angel of Death, with 36 murders to his name, all of them his own patients. Wigg was on his way to execution when the plane went down. He had abducted an EMT when they stopped to help him, murdered her partner, knocked her out, and is now trying to use her to get a medical helicopter to escape. Sarah, wisely deciding she has had enough trauma for one lifetime, calls Frank, and he and Sydney speed over. With Sarah's help, they quickly capture the creepy killer. Wig, however, has powerful leverage. He reveals that Timothy O'Bannon, one of the crashed plane pilots, is alive. Wig has been keeping him going with specific meds to fight severe brain swelling, but O'Bannon needs a dose every 8 hours or he is toast. Wig's demand for the pilot's life is simple: get his safe deposit box delivered to him, and he insists the bank president must bring it personally. Hutch is skeptical that the pilot is alive and thinks Wig is just bluffing, but Frank knows they cannot gamble with a life. He does the only sensible thing in a crisis. He calls Havelock, who, despite the whole blackout, is doing very fine. Havelock confirms Wig's story, and Frank's immediate focus now is getting Wig what he wants. Sydney is seriously anxious about the FBI decrypting the fake Archive 6 Havelock left them, so she finally comes clean to Frank. She admits, it's not Archive 6, it's the missile guidance malware that brought the plane down. This confirms the crash was a deliberate, targeted CIA assassination attempt on Havelock, with everyone else being collateral damage. The girl is always hiding something, but Frank already knew that. Well, there is more. She confesses that she originally devised the malware years ago for a shelved assassination attempt on a Chinese diplomat, and the CIA secretly dusted it off to target Havelock's flight. Now that the assassination attempt on Havelock failed, she is terrified the CIA will pin the whole disaster on her to cover their own deadly tracks, since she is the original architect. But they can't really dwell on that right now, because they have pinpointed Havelock's location again. Before they can get there, though, Vincent Tiago beats them to it. At this point, the plot is so messy. The assumption was that Jadonko sent Tiago to deliver the Archive 6 hardware to Havelock, but now we know Tiago is working for the CIA. So does that mean it wasn't Archive 6 Jadonko sent? Or did they get the wrong courier? And if Tiago crashed the plane with the hardware, how did Havelock then get his hands on it to leave for the cops? Hopefully we get more answers later on. For now, Tiago is captured by the marshals, and all that is left is how to land a medical plane with the power outage. The entire community gathers, lining the airstrip with trucks and headlights to create a makeshift runway. What great small-town spirit. Wig is brought out to collect his precious safe deposit box. And what's inside is just sick. It's the pictures of all his victims, his trophy, and the person he insisted hand-deliver it is none other than the mother of his first victim. The audacity. He claims he freed her dying son from pain, and she frees Wig from this world with a single bullet. Despite Wig's abrupt exit, the team successfully retrieves O'Bannon. The pilot later reveals Havelock was the one who actually intervened and helped save lives during the crash. This throws a major wrench into the CIA's entire Havelock is the ultimate villain framing. We finally travel back 4 years to Chicago, and it is a pure dose of emotional devastation. Frank, Luke, and their late daughter Ruby are having a happy evening heading out for ice cream. Ruby, being the sweetest kid ever, rushes back to the car to add an item to her wish list jar. Frank walks toward the car with a hot chocolate, and then, BAM! A vehicle pulls up, 2 men open fire targeting Frank, and Ruby is caught in the crossfire. It is a tragedy of the highest order. Luke witnessed the entire thing, explaining his trauma and why he thinks he is a curse. He was the one who suggested the outing. Little did they know, this trauma is just a terrible side effect of Frank's own messy, professional life. In the present, Frank and the troopers are frustrated. They need to question Tiago, but the CIA has scrubbed his existence, making him a literal ghost. Sydney, determined to get answers and clear her name, convinces Frank to let her join the questioning. She threatens Tiago, warning that reconstructing his erased life makes him a liability to the CIA, which would mean certain death. Unbeknownst to them, Havelock is listening in, having slipped a microphone onto Tiago earlier. Tiago is completely unaffected by the threats, willing to lose everything for the mission. Word of Tiago in custody forces Sydney's boss, Bradford, to take control. We learn the CIA is close to neutralizing Havelock's dead man switch, meaning his archive leverage is about to disappear when they scrub the archive clean. The power finally returns. Thanks to an inmate getting electrocuted during an attempt to kill Frank, the radios recalibrate and pick up a mysterious transmission inside the command post. Sydney realizes, wait, Tiago is wired. She finds the mic immediately, assuming it's the CIA's doing, until the signal traces back straight to Havelock. Frank gets a call home and heads out, planning to finally come clean about the stuff in his basement that Havelock has been holding over his head, which is revealed to be a gun. Too late. Sarah and Luke already found it and demand the truth. Years ago, he'd been after Paddy Coogan, a monster who'd been raping and murdering people and skating past justice every time. They finally found a gun they believed belonged to him, but the prints didn't match, meaning technically he could walk free. The cops hid the gun so they could still nail him, because society was safer with that man behind bars. Problem is, this was the one crime Coogan didn't commit. And when he realized Frank had framed him, he ordered the hit on Frank, and Ruby was the innocent victim. Luke is absolutely furious. He's blamed himself for years because he encouraged them to go get ice cream, and now he realizes it was never his fault. When work immediately calls Frank away, Sarah is in shock and tells Frank to leave. That marriage is officially on life support. The team traces Havelock's earlier mic signal to a fire tower, but when they arrive, he's already gone. His sloppy exit is totally out of character, which makes Sydney suspect something rattled him. And she's right. He's gone after the one thing that still threatens him, the NSA listening post storing a copy of his data. He corners a low-level worker to give up the location, then heads straight to the dock. The listening post is a maritime vessel, and by the time its security team realizes something is wrong, Havelock is already inside, neutralizing most of them, locking up the rest, and tearing through their archive for the file he needs. Sydney tries to warn Bradford, but Bradford ignores her calls. She doesn't want Sydney knowing the dead man's switch is already down, and by the time Frank and Sydney reach the docks, Havelock is long gone. He escapes with the data, hotwires a car, and takes off. But Frank, flying overhead in a plane, spots him and literally dive bombs the vehicle, sending Havelock crashing off the road. Sydney reaches the wreckage first, drags him out of the burning car, and Havelock is finally captured. With Havelock back at the command post, Frank decides the last remaining inmate, Julian Steele, spotted in Tulsa, is now Oklahoma's problem, not his jurisdiction. When the FBI arrives to take Havelock, Frank sticks his neck out for Sydney, demanding she ride along because she is invaluable to the investigation. It's the first time he's fully backed her, and it lasts about 5 minutes. Because when Frank gets home, reminiscing with the old pictures of his daughter, something clicks. The photos of Tiago they got, there's a little girl in the picture. Sydney had said the girl would probably be her age by now, so Frank searches online for Sydney's baby pictures. He doesn't really see it, so he pivots to searching for her dad. That's when she realizes it's Sydney's dad, Robert Schofield, and young Sydney in the picture with Tiago. Tiago was her dad's protege, and she has known him her whole life. Meaning Tiago is not working for the CIA, he is working for Sydney. She downed the plane and orchestrated the whole thing, playing Frank the entire time. En route to wherever the FBI plans to stash them, Havelock finally lays it all out. He's figured out Sydney was the one who brought the plane down and set the whole drama into motion. This is what shook him earlier. He heard her talking to Tiago in the cage, questioning why he let himself get captured, and that betrayal is exactly what made Havelock sloppy. Right on cue, Frank's call hits the agents' radios, warning them not to let Sydney anywhere near Havelock, but that warning shows up about 3 seconds too late. Sydney already has her gun out. Havelock lunges, because he is absolutely not dying today. The agents scramble in, trying to pry the gun away, but end up all getting dropped. The driver gets hit too, which causes an accident. Sydney is the first to wake up, and she holds Havelock at gunpoint. Then we jump back 1 month earlier. Sydney and Havelock are having a lovely, if slightly stressed, night in Paris. Havelock is spiraling, wondering what the future holds when his contract elapses. The CIA does not exactly let someone with so much classified information roam freely. He is thinking of getting leverage on them, but Sydney is highly against trying to get a bargaining chip over the CIA. That kind of thing gets people killed, and she truly believes that as long as he does not pose a threat, he is fine. Their conversation is interrupted by a call. Sydney is summoned to a CIA locale because a double agent named Victor Voss suddenly appears asking specifically for her, which is strange because she had gone out of her way to be invisible in Paris. Victor wants safe passage out of Paris in exchange for the truth about what happened to her dad. That's all Sydney needs to hear. She agrees to help him escape Paris, except a few minutes later, a Russian hit squad walks in. Sydney handles them with a homemade explosive, but Voss is fatally wounded. Before he dies, though, he reveals he was the one who killed her father. That attack pushes Havelock deeper into his paranoia. He's gone ahead with getting leverage. He buried a line of code in one of his contact reports that leads to a classified server back in Langley. There's a file on it, Archive 6, still active and big enough to bring down the entire CIA. They also learn most of the Artwater Protocol agents gets eliminated after the program. He was so right to be paranoid. Their digging leads them to Sharon Tidwell, the woman who handled Voss's cover jobs and refused to testify against him. When they visit her, Sharon practically begs them to stop, telling them Archive 6 is way above their weight class. But that only makes them push harder. Bradford then calls Sydney in, because Havelock's IP has popped up on a classified CIA server. Sydney tries to steer suspicion away from him, but Bradford isn't buying a single sentence. That same day, Sydney's mother hands her the photo of young Sydney and her father, with Vincent Tiago. When Sydney tracks him down, Tiago recognizes her immediately and gives her the truth her father never got to say out loud. Robert Schofield created the Archive-6 program to eliminate truly dangerous people, the worst of the worst, but Bradford twisted it into a global hit list, even using it for her own personal power plays. She killed off the freelancers who carried out the hits to keep the program airtight. When Robert saw what the program had become, he started collecting enough intel to expose her, which sealed his fate. Tiago was Robert's protege and vanished after the murder to survive. Hearing all of this, Havelock begs Sydney to run with him, use Archive-6 as their shield, and disappear forever. But Sydney refuses. She wants justice for her father and every other person wiped out by the program. When Havelock is inevitably captured, it seems she leaked his address though? Or were they listening to their call? Because Havelock set a rendezvous for her to meet him if she wants to flee with him. Anyway, Sydney knows Havelock's death is inevitable, so she wants to make it mean something. If she crashes the plane before he gets to his destination, the dead man's switch Havelock set on Archive-6, which he is supposed to input a code every 7 hours, will auto-distribute, given he would be dead. That way Bradford is taken down, and Sydney's hand is clean, except she didn't factor in the fact that Havelock would be transported with other prisoners. She assumed it was a cargo. We see how everything unfolded. Based on her CIA knowledge, she knew Havelock would be transported through Alaska, so while she was being interrogated by the CIA for her involvement with Havelock, Tiago met up with Zdanko. Zdanko actually developed a malware designed to trigger a fuel leak and detonate a plane mid-air for Sydney and Havelock years ago to assassinate a Chinese diplomat, but they didn't get to use it then. And this was the exchange the FBI saw and assumed Zdanko was handing Archive-6 hardware to a courier, not knowing it was the malware that Sydney needed for her plan. We never see how Tiago gets the malware onto the transport plane, but he calls Sydney to confirm she really wants to go through with this, knowing the man she loves is about to die in the wreckage. Moments later, the plane goes down. Havelock instantly recognizes the failure. It's the exact malware he and Sydney shelved years ago. He helps the pilot stabilize, saving everyone on board. From there, the CIA drags Sydney back into play, and the story we've been following unfolds. And while I also thought Havelock played her, it turns out he really did love her. Because in the present, after all the dust settles, he admits the CIA has already neutralized the dead man's switch. Bradford even confirms it, practically smug about knowing Sydney was behind the crash the whole time. But Bradford doesn't get the last laugh, because Havelock still has Archive-6, rebuilt into a hard drive he carved into his own body, and he hands it to Sydney before she disappears. Frank finds Havelock alone among the body count of FBI agents, and Sydney is nowhere to be found. Man is pissed. He questions Havelock about Sydney's whereabouts immediately, but then he gets a call from her asking him to stop chasing her. Frank refuses, of course. To him, Sydney is the most dangerous person around. She is the one who caused the plane crash, unleashing hell on his town. Sydney warns him, things will not get better until she exposes Bradford, and nothing will stop her. And speaking of demons, Bradford finally lands in Fairbanks. Her first order of business? Find Sydney. Kill Sydney. And once Havelock is out of Marshall custody, kill him too. When Frank hears Bradford is in town, he knows he needs context. Havelock finally lays it all out for him. Archive-6 isn't just data, it's the CIA's kill list, Bradford's pet project. She's been naming enemies, political threats, anyone inconvenient, and eliminating them off the books with zero judicial oversight. Sydney's father was one of those casualties. That's why Sydney's on this mission. That's why she'll burn down the world to finish it. Frank understands her motivations, but he still promises he's bringing her in. People died because of her plan. Someone has to answer for that. Havelock warns him he better get to Sydney first. If Bradford reaches her, Sydney dies, and so does the truth. Frank launches a statewide manhunt, but he isn't the only one closing in. Bradford marches into the command center like she owns the place, dismissing the troopers and the FBI, and demanding Havelock and Tiago be handed over. Frank reminds her, Alaska is not Langley's playground. She has zero jurisdiction here. She threatens him behind closed doors, warning that refusing her will end badly. Frank walks right out on her. They get a tip. Someone spotted Sydney at a pharmacy. And Sydney, by the way, has gone full wilderness operative. She survived the snow, infiltrated a stranger's house, and took out a man twice her size just to buy time. An older woman recognizes her at the pharmacy and quietly alerts the troopers. Poor Geraldo, the store clerk, gets dragged straight into this because he was just trying to help her pick a box die. Bradford intercepts the call. She somehow has a trooper radio in her car and reaches the pharmacy first. She picks Geraldo up, squeezes him for intel, learns Sydney asked about the Denali Star train, then dumps him alone in the middle of the frozen wilderness. And with that, Bradford has enough to predict Sydney's next move. She knows Sydney needs something like an SIPERnet uplink to transmit Archive 6. Briggs, on Frank's team, reaches the same conclusion. Sydney boards the Denali Star with dyed hair and sunglasses. Bradford plants men on the train, and they eventually spot her. Sydney takes a hostage, forces her way off at the next station, Healy, and slips away again. Bradford runs a quick search and realizes Healy is home to the Nenana Hydroelectric Dam, which has exactly the kind of satellite uplink Sydney needs to upload Archive 6 without being stopped. With Frank gone, Havelock manages the most theatrical escape of the entire series. He creates a fake grenade using grease and an apple. When an angry FBI agent swings his gun and pins Havelock down to avenge his dead coworkers, Havelock scares him off with the fake apple grenade. Scared for his life, the agent complies, giving Havelock his jacket and keys. After escaping, the first thing he does is ask Tiago how he managed to convince Sydney to kill her husband. Tiago explains that Sydney was okay with his death as long as it ended Bradford's killing game. Tiago ultimately creates a scene allowing Havelock to slip out the back. When Sydney gets to the Nenana Hydroelectric Dam, Bradford and her team catch up and hold her at gunpoint. As for Frank, he realizes the tip-off at the pharmacy was actually called in by Sydney herself. Why would Sydney want to be caught? Well, while Frank is trying to figure that out, Havelock steps out from behind Sydney and casually greets Bradford. Of course, Sydney lured Bradford to the dam for a reason. Havelock had already exposed Bradford's whole pattern of using operatives around the world and discarding them like trash once their missions were done. Half those operatives are now hiding in the shadows, listening to Bradford casually confess that yes, she did all that, and so what? She's planning to frame Havelock and Sydney as traitors anyway. The only question on my mind is the operatives protecting Bradford herself after these confessions. Is it that they can't hear? Anyway, the operatives in the shadows burst out, and Bradford starts justifying her actions, yammering on about doing it for the greater good. While they handle her, Sydney slips to go upload the drive. Like bro, it took forever to even get to the room to start uploading, but I kinda knew it wasn't gonna be that easy. Bradford, knowing she is headed for a nice long stay in either the Great Beyond or a concrete cell, decides to go out blazing. She starts a massive shootout between the agents protecting her, which, again, makes zero sense after her confession, and the newly arrived operatives. Then she breaks away to hunt down Sydney before that upload finishes. The upload is at 72% when Bradford kills the power and ambushes Sydney. They fight their way right back out onto the dam. Bradford stabs Sydney, grabs the archive, and tries to finish her off, but they both tumble over the edge, dangling precariously over the water. Sydney manages to yank the drive back and gives Bradford a good hard shove. Good riddance. Havelock is almost executed by Bradford's men when Frank's team arrives. Then Havelock proceeds to pull Sydney up as she is about to give up. She's bleeding heavily from the stab wound, which becomes Frank's focus. Sydney urges Havelock to use the fact that the marshals are focused on keeping her alive to escape. Frank spots him running and chases after him, but ultimately has to let him go, because getting Sydney to a hospital is slightly more important than catching him right now, given his other marshals are not really motivated to save Sydney like him. The nearest hospital is far away, so after a quick stabilization from a nearby doctor, they realize she needs a blood transfusion stat. Frank's solution? Dogs to drag the stretcher, then meeting another car on the way. The new driver is not exactly thrilled, considering Sydney's grand plan wreaked havoc on his town and got Donnie killed. But a quick threat from Frank solves that, and Sydney finally makes it to the hospital alive. She feels consumed by guilt for dragging her father's pristine, by-the-book legacy through the mud. But Frank assures her that nobody is really straight, citing the hidden gun evidence as a prime example of human imperfection. Sydney knows she is going to jail and has made peace with it, and Frank has given the Archive 6 drive to a politician he trusts to launch a full investigation. Havelock is also found dead in his car, which Frank immediately clocks as fake, just like the rest of us. But since the marshals are so keen to believe it, Frank lets them. The whole investigation is closed, and Frank returns to an empty home until Sarah and Luke show up. They needed space to think, and now they want to move on together as family, but that's when Frank starts talking about, "I'm gonna turn the gun into the police and turn myself in." Sarah and Luke are emphatically against this, telling him it is time to destroy the gun and bury that past. He eventually agrees after some solid persuasion, and a few days later, they are having a loving, happy family unit, only for Havelock to call again. Frank knew he wasn't dead, but as long as he was not causing issues in his town, he didn't really have a problem with him. But Frank is still gonna have a problem with Havelock, because he is about to ambush the cops transporting a shackled Sydney to break his wife out. The fact that the season ends the exact same way it started is hilarious. It began with the husband in shackles, and now it's the wife. Talk about symmetry.